The file opens with a tremor of static, as if the cold of the Arctic is still trapped inside the paper. On the first page, in pale wartime ink, someone has written, "Not to be copied. Material obtained by boarding operations north of Iceland. Immediate distribution to Admiralty Signals Division only." Beneath the warning, a second note is added in graphite, almost casual in tone. "This is the one that broke the weather war." For decades, the record sat unseen. A simple story at first glance. A small British boarding party stormed a drifting German weather ship in thick fog. But in that fog lay the fulcrum of the entire North Atlantic campaign, because on that ship were the very keys, the Enigma settings, the meteorological cipher tables, the Kurzsignale groups that allowed Bletchley Park to lift the veil from the Kriegsmarine's encrypted world. A dozen men, one ship, a handful of books, and the outcome of the Atlantic War swung on their decision to advance through mist toward a vessel they could barely see. The Second World War began swallowing Europe in 1939, and by 1940 the North Atlantic had become a battlefield unlike any that came before it. Britain's survival depended on convoys bringing food, fuel, aircraft, ammunition. Lifelines stretched across an ocean patrolled by German U-boats. The Kriegsmarine believed the Atlantic was theirs to carve. Admiral Dönitz had built a submarine force designed to tear the arteries from Britain's throat, and the wolf packs were winning. The British had one hope: crack the ciphers that coordinated the U-boats. But Enigma, especially naval Enigma, was the most secure system of its time. And to break it, the codebreakers needed more than genius. They needed the actual books, the key sheets, the signal tables. Without those, the Atlantic stayed black. The German weather ships were the weak seam. Few outside the intelligence world noticed them. They were small auxiliary vessels disguised as trawlers or research craft, drifting in the empty spaces between Iceland, Greenland, and the Arctic ice. Their role seemed harmless: collect weather data and transmit it to Germany. But that data fed the Luftwaffe, guided the U-boats, and determined when and where wolf packs surfaced to strike. And each of those ships carried an Enigma machine, and more importantly, the most current cipher keys. Every few weeks, the Germans rotated the weather ships into new positions. Each rotation required fresh codebooks, and that practice, repeated again and again, created an opportunity. In May and June 1941, British intelligence tracked two such vessels: the trawler München and a more modern craft, the Lauenburg. Both were north of Iceland, transmitting weather traffic every 12 hours. The Admiralty realized these ships were floating Enigma vaults. They carried the keys Bletchley needed to pry open the naval code. A decision was made: send hunters into the Arctic fog, HMS Nigeria, HMS Bulldog, and a handful of armed trawlers and destroyers. Among them was the team that would board the Lauenburg and bring home the prize. It was late dawn when the British intercepted the vessel. The fog was so dense that the sea and sky blended into a single gray infinity. Only the faint hum of an engine suggested a ship ahead. The British helmsman throttled low. No gunfire, no warning. They wanted surprise, not destruction. Out of the fog, the outline of the German weather ship appeared, motionless in the blank ocean. She looked harmless, almost feeble, her decks coated in frost, her crew half asleep after a night of transmissions. It was the smallest and most vulnerable of all Kriegsmarine auxiliaries. And yet, on that morning, she carried secrets that the U-boats depended on. The boarding party assembled in silence. They were sailors, not commandos. No dramatic uniforms, no specialized gear. Just cold steel rifles, rope lines, and practiced resolve. Their commander briefed them quickly. If the Germans reach the codebooks first, the mission is over. They will burn them, weight them, and throw them into the sea. You have seconds, no more, to prevent it." The order was given. The British drew alongside. The sea was calm, dangerously so, the way it becomes when storms gather far beyond sight. The men leapt from boat to boat, boots landing on the slick deck of the Lauenburg. Shouts tore through the cold air. German crew scrambled. Someone tried to reach the radio room where the cipher books were stored. But the British moved faster. They kicked open the radio cabin door. A German rating stood over a safe, fumbling with matches, trying to light the destruction charges. The British slammed him aside. Another sailor tried to dump weighted satchels into the water through an open porthole. He was tackled before he could finish the motion. 20 seconds, that was all. 20 seconds in which the future of the Atlantic changed. The British grabbed everything: Enigma wheels, weather cipher tables, the daily key lists for June, the abbreviated signal books, and the meteorological codes that govern the encrypted climate traffic. The men stuffed the materials into oilskin bags, shouting to each other through the fog as the German captain ordered his crew to scuttle the ship. Explosive charges cracked in the hold. Smoke rose from the lower decks. "Back to the boats!" someone yelled. The British retreated in a blur of motion. The Lauenburg was dying. She rolled, groaned, and listed toward the gray water. The German crew abandoned ship. Within minutes, the vessel slipped beneath the surface, consumed by the ocean she had served. But her heart, the codebooks, was already gone. The boarding team returned to their escort vessel, soaked, trembling from cold, and carrying one of the most valuable intelligence hauls of the war. For most of them, it was simply another operation. They did not yet grasp what they had done. But Bletchley Park understood instantly. The oilskin bags were rushed by fast courier to England. At Bletchley, cryptanalysts unfolded pages still damp with Arctic mist. There they found exactly what they had prayed for: the updated Enigma weather setting sheets for the summer of 1941, material that allowed them to solve the Hydra weather cipher and read German meteorological traffic in real time. That mattered more than anyone outside Room 40 could have imagined, because the weather network governed the U-boats, their surfacing schedules, their rendezvous points, their wolf-pack regroupings, their battery charges, their coordinated attacks on convoys heading to Britain. The Germans believed their weather traffic was trivial, safe, not worth protecting. They were catastrophically wrong. With the Lauenburg documents, Bletchley Park began exploiting the regularity of German weather patterns, the repeated phrases, the predictable formats, the meteorological jargon. Those things became codebreakers' footholds. Hydra fell. Then its linked keys fell. And in the months that followed, the wider naval Enigma system weakened. Convoys that once sailed blind began receiving U-boat positional estimates. Wolf-packs that had roamed unchecked found convoys waiting for them with escorts prepared. Ships that would have died in the Black Atlantic survived the crossing, and it began with a dozen men stepping through fog onto a vessel no larger than a fishing boat. The file does not describe them as heroes. It describes them as a party of seamen conducting standard interception procedure. But there is a brief note on page 7 in a different typeface, perhaps added years later. Had this mission failed, Enigma meteorological recovery would have been set back by months. U-boat losses would have been lower. Convoy sinking substantially higher. The war continued. Cities burned. Armies bled. The Atlantic stayed dangerous. But the curve had begun to bend. By 1942, the Allies could read enough naval traffic to anticipate wolf-pack concentrations. The introduction of centimetric radar and long-range aircraft further choked the U-boats, and eventually the supply lines stabilized. Convoys arrived with fewer empty berths. Britain could breathe again. All of that, at its root, ties back to the thin stack of papers taken off a German weather ship in thick Arctic fog. The Lauenburg was not the only captured weather ship. Others followed. But she was the one that shifted the mathematics of the war. The Germans never suspected how deeply the British had penetrated their cipher ecosystem. They assumed the weather ship codebooks had gone down with the vessel. They never realized the boarding party had seized them intact. In a war defined by titanic battles, Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein, the operation looked small, a skirmish, almost trivial. Yet the Second World War was shaped not only by grand offensives but by tiny decisive acts carried out in silence. A moment of hesitation on a German deck, a British sailor grabbing a satchel before it touched the water, a spark failing to ignite the destruction charge, a page saved from flame, a cipher table salvaged from the sea, a convoy surviving because of a decrypted message, a ship reaching Liverpool, a nation enduring, quiet moments, vast consequences. In the charred margins of the final report, one sentence remains untouched by time. It is written without flourish, without exaggeration, in the understated tone of the men who lived their lives behind locked doors and blank documents. This operation, executed under fog and without loss of life, significantly altered the outcome of the Atlantic campaign. There were no medals, no speeches, no headlines. Only a group of men returning south through fog, unaware that they had changed the war. The Arctic closed behind them. The Lauenburg slept on the ocean floor, but the cipher keys they carried continued echoing through the war's remaining years, shaping decisions, saving lives, and bending the history of the North Atlantic. This is their story, a story of silence, precision, and the quiet kind of courage that leaves no monument. Only a thin file in a forgotten drawer that tells how a tiny boarding team stepped from mist onto a German ship and brought home the secrets that broke the sea war.